All right, so the first thing we're going to do is get this website's HTML, but actually it's the same exact process as JSON, because remember JSON works through the address line. So just like we can input a request to the API and get stuff back in browser, the same way we can input HTTP address and get HTML back from the browser. Okay, so we can use the same kind of libraries. In this case, last week we used urllib2. In this case, we're going to use urllib1 because it happens to work better with this website. So this is going to be the same kind of structure, but it's going to be slightly different code to use this other library. So I'm going to start with, since we already covered functions and everything last week, I'm just going to start writing the function that I need to fetch the code from the internet. I'm not going to go through the whole kind of first writing it out and then encapsulating a function. I'm just going to rewrite this function right away. So you remember this fetch from last week. This is what we're going to call to access the HTML from our website. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a print statement of the URL. So here I'm passing a web address into fetch. I'm going to print it as a debugging metric. This is really important because if you have an error, it's really nice to have a printout of the last website you tried to go to, because then you can start up Chrome and just enter that website in and see what's happening. Is the website just not loading? Is it the wrong address? Or is there something messing up in Python? All right, the next thing I'm going to do is use this urllib. I'm going to use urllib, the basic one. Okay, so we had 2 last time. This is just urllib. I'm going to use a function from that called url retrieve. And into that function goes URL, and then URL retrieve is slightly different than what we used last time. It actually passes back like a file, which we just have to give to a name too. Okay, so this can be arbitrary. So remember, before I use a library, I have to import it. So we're just gonna throw that up. This is a typical way of building up code. You figure out what library you want to use. You put the function. It's going to complain, saying there's no such thing in the document, and you just go up to the top of your document and throw the import up there. Okay, so URL retrieve will give us back this thing called myfile, which will contain all the structure of the website. It's like the HTML code. And then just like last time, we get this thing back. It's just some file. We have to actually read it to gain access to that text. Okay, in this case, data is going to be my variable to store that HTML. And for reading these files, you need another library called gzip, because these files come in as zipped files. So just like you compress a file in Windows, these files come back compressed. So we just need to uncompress them with gzip. So I import gzip on top, and I use it now. Gzip.open. Open is the function to uncompress a file, and then I give it the name of the file. This is the same name I specified up here, and then I tell it how I want it to open that file. Don't worry too much about this for now, just use it. Basically, this tells Python whether you want to read the file, you want to write to the file, or you want to do both. So when we do R, that means read. B just stands for binary. You don't have to worry about that. We're always going to use either RB or WB. Read binary or write binary. Okay, and then so now that the file is uncompressed, we actually want to read the file. We did this last week with the code. We open it, we download it, we uncompress it, and then we have to read the text from it. And in Python, just like a lot of languages, we can actually gang together a lot of these functions by just listing them one after the other with dots, the dot syntax. Okay, so in this case, this has already unzipped my file, and I can do something like this: data equals data.open, or sorry, .read. Okay, so what this does is data is set to the file, which is the unzipped version of this, and then data equals data.read is basically like I'm reading data and then I'm setting that back to data. Okay, so I don't need a new variable each time. I can kind of work on it as it goes. But in order to simplify the code, Python actually allows us to shortcut this step. Instead of having 2 lines, we can actually just amend this dot directly to the end of that call. Okay, and remember the dots give us access to functions. So we just take this thing and we just keep applying functions by just adding the dots. So that's our basic fetch. There's a few other things. Remember, the reason I like to put this into a function because I use it all over and over, and I want to make sure that some specific things happen every time I get a piece of information from the web. The first thing we covered last time, which are sleeps or mandatory blocks on the code. Last time there was a specific number of seconds we need to delay in order to not violate the Weibo limits. In this case, it's something a little bit more intuitive, but we're going to do the same function, so time sleep, and here we have to import time up top. In this case, we just want to think like, there's no hard restrictions because this actually isn't something that Sofon supports. But if you start to call their website and download information from the server, they're paying for that server space. What happens is they store all this data, right, on their server, this database. Every time it gets pulled from wherever it is in China to New York, they're paying for that bandwidth. Okay, they're paying for that transfer of data. And they monitor their data flows the same as any website. And basically, if you start to flood their servers with the requests that happen more often than they expect, they can block your IP address, which will basically not allow you to open that site from your computer, okay? So in order for that, and they're well in their rights to do this because again, they're paying for it. So if you're just flooding them with like requests, then it's not a very nice thing to do. So if we think intuitively about how many requests you can make that like won't generate an unexpected amount of traffic on the network, we could think of like how fast you might possibly browse a website. If you're looking for things, you might want to open, you might be able to open a website every 1 second. There's just a rule of thumb I've been using and I've never gotten blocked. So I like to throw in these sleeps just to give it a little bit of time. So basically every time a website is accessed, it's gonna pause for 1 second. Like you're browsing the web and clicking 1 second. Okay, so that's the sleep. We had that last time. Now this is specific to this exercise. I want to put in some code to decode this information. I'll do that in a second, but basically encoding, I mentioned last time, it has to do with how everything but Latin characters are stored in the computer. Each for Chinese characters, because there's more than 128 of them, they have to be stored in a series of bytes, okay? And basically each character has a code. It's like a /U and then a number that represents the character. That's how the data will come in at first. So I'm gonna show you how the data comes in and you won't be able to read it. And then I'll just show you, what you have to basically do is when it gets to Python, you have to translate it to the Chinese characters, okay? So I throw that into the fetch function as well. Okay, so now that we have that function, I'm gonna make a parameter or a variable to store my URL. I'm gonna call it base URL, and I'm just gonna copy and paste this website that we just went to. This will be our basic check. And then, just like last week, I'm gonna make a variable called page, and I'm gonna fetch information from that base URL. I'm putting that URL into this function. So I need a return statement. And I'm gonna return this data that I got. Remember, you need this for inputs and return for outputs. Okay, so now I have this page. So this should work now, and I should get the HTML back from this page variable. So I'm just gonna run this, see what happens. All right, so it printed my debugging kind of code, this print URL. So I see that, okay, this is the website I went to. And the HTML should be stored in page, so I'm gonna print this. Here it is, right? It's a mess. But this is literally, if you go to view source, this is what it is. This is all HTML. Now you see here, these are Chinese characters. Okay, so if you're doing this for English websites, not a big deal. This will be text. But Chinese in this case is encoded in this \x whatever. Sometimes it's encoded differently. Sometimes it's \U 4 letter numbers. Now it's \x these numbers. These are just different ways that people have figured out to store non-Latin characters. So the same thing, Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, Russian, Cyrillic, same stuff, right? And there's all these different ways to do it, and it's extremely frustrating. because you never quite know until you get the data what encoding they're going to use. And the main task for us is to take whatever their encoding is, recognize the encoding, and then decode it so we have the actual text, right? And the only difficulty here is you have to tell Python what method was used to encode it. Okay, luckily there's only a few kinds. UTF-8 is a really typical encoding method. China has developed their own encoding method. For China, it's GB2312. And a lot of websites at the top will actually tell you, if they're nice, will tell you what encoding method to use with this char set. Again, don't worry about this. We're not going to deal with this in class until it comes out. This is not a class about HTML protocols and the mess that is the World Wide Web right now. We're going to make it work, okay? And for now, because we're going to be using Chinese websites a lot, I'm going to tell you this is the case. If you're using Japanese, you might use UTF-8 or something like this, okay? So this is the type of encoding that they're using. So now in here, when we get the data, before we return it, I'm just going to decode it, okay, using this information. And to decode something, this functionality is built into Python. So here we have our data. We just say data dot, and we're going to call a function on this piece of text, which is our HTML, to decode it back to Chinese text. Okay? And another complication is you can't just say, so the function is decode, and into here you have to pass it, in quotations, the name of the encoding. So to decode this type of encoding, it's called in Python GBK. Okay? So we'll just run that. It's the same exact thing, but now when we print our page data, it's the same thing, but now you see it looks makes a little bit more sense. We see some of these Chinese characters in here. It's just been decoded. All right, so everything that was that weird encoded structure now is the Chinese characters.